I'd like to take a few minutes to share about Ask Resource Center. We are a family-focused nonprofit here in the state of Iowa. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Um, as a family-focused nonprofit, our mission is to empower the families of people with disabilities. We provide individual support, a collaborative advocacy, training, resources, and leadership development for Iowa families of children with disabilities or special healthcare needs. We thank you for joining us for this webinar titled School Removal and Discipline. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded and will be available shortly for viewing on our YouTube page and at our Ask website. Additionally, the recording and the PowerPoint will be sent out to anybody who is registered for this webinar. If you have any questions as our presenters are speaking today, please feel free to use the chat feature and they will be addressed at the Q&A section at the end of our webinar. And we finally we want to let you know at the end there will be a survey sent out to you in your email. These surveys help us in just understanding what information you would like to hear from us and give us feedback on how we are doing. So if you could take a few minutes to fill that out at the end, once that's emailed to you, that would be super helpful. So today we have three presenters. They are same presenters from last week. We have Jean Boger. Jean has been a school social worker for Heartland AEA for over 16 years. Throughout her time with Heartland, she has served in a variety of rural and metro school districts where she is focused primarily on supporting students with social, emotional, and behavioral issues. This has included evaluating students for special education services, conducting functional behavior assessments, and developing behavior intervention plans, and serving as an IEP team member. We have Sarah Mercer, who is currently the Director of IDEA Services and a Regional Director for Boone County Schools for Heartland AEA. Sarah is also a trained special education teacher and school psychologist. Sarah is passionate about delivering high-quality services to students, advocating for adherence to special education law, and fostering meaningful collaboration between students and parents in special education processes. And we also have Jason Vollmer. He has worked as in special education for more than 25 years, serving as a school psychologist and special education director. Currently, he is working as a school psychologist serving grades 8 through 12 in Ankeny. He also has 3 children who have or had social, emotional, and behavioral IEPs and has experienced manifestation, determinations, and removals in his role as a parent, district leader, and school psychologist. So I will let them take over.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Before we get started too much here, I just wanted to thank you again for reaching out to us. We are happy to partner with Ask Resource. Certainly are very glad to be a part of the work that you do and to be a part of partnership with you as well. So I'm going to have you go ahead and advance to the next slide. Just a couple little housekeeping notes from us too about what this presentation is and is not meant to focus on. So it's not going to focus on absenteeism. So Iowa's newer chronic absentee laws or actions that are taken based on students' absences that are the parents or the family's choice. We're not going to be talking about that, nor will we be talking about homeschooling or competent private instruction. Instead, we're really going to focus about removal of students from school due to either medical or disciplinary actions. Go ahead. Thank you. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about both medical and discipline removals. We're going to talk about the types of disciplinary actions that are removals, including in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and expulsion. We're going to talk about disciplinary changes of placement and the obligation of the school to provide FAPE during those changes of placement. And then we're also going to talk about next steps for effective solutions. So to kick us off, there are really a couple different reasons that a school might say a child can't stay at school. The first reason I think is the easiest to understand, and that's for a medical reason. So if a child is sick or injured, the school might call parents and ask them to pick them up take them home according to their own school policy. So, for example, your students out on the playground, they fall, they hurt themselves, and the medical care that they need is more than the school nurse can provide. They might call you as the parent and say, "Hey, I think your child might be really hurt. You should probably come pick them up." They could do the same type of a thing if your child has a fever, vomiting, that sort of thing. And that's a pretty typical thing that happens for all children who are in school. Schools may also remove a child for behavioral issues. And just to be clear, all students have to follow school rules. That includes students who have 504 plans as well as IEPs. And when students break those rules or don't meet behavioral expectations, schools do have the authority to apply disciplinary procedures. The three different types of removals that we're going to talk a little bit more about here today are removing students into either in school suspension, out of school suspension, or expulsion. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, in school suspension refers to a temporary removal from the classroom environment. So from the classroom setting itself, but the student still remains in the building. So, a lot of times in secondary schools, at least, there might be a separate classroom that children go to or students go to when they are serving in school suspension. When students are younger, there might not be an actual classroom. They may be in the office or they may be supervised by an adult, but they stay in the school building. Out of school suspension, on the other hand, is when students don't remain in the building. They are removed from school grounds for a set period of time. And typically, what happens in either one of these instances for suspension is a member of the school administrative team reaches out to parents, tells them what happened, tells them about the situation and the rule infraction that occurred, and then talks to them about that the discipline or the punishment for that is going to be an in school or an out of school suspension. Expulsion is removal from school grounds. So, not just the school building itself, but it could be extracurricular activities, could be a lot of different things. But this occurs for the remainder of the school year, or code says it could exist or it could be implemented for up to 2 semesters. Now, and a school administrator is not going to call you and say your child is expelled from school or expelled from school. They will say your child's being removed from school. They may talk about expulsion, but the school board for your school district are the people who take action towards expulsion. That doesn't happen simply within a school administrator. The Iowa Disabilities, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 504 lists some pretty clear expectations regarding removals from programming. So, a child, the main one, a child with a disability cannot be excluded from education for more than 10 days. It's very clear in code, it's very clear in the Section 504 expectations as well. So, what does this mean regarding in school suspension, out of school, or expulsion? How do these 10 days work? Well, if a student is in school suspension, but they have access to their schoolwork, the work that they would be doing in special ed, or in general education, as well as their special education services, then that does not count as a day out of school. It does not count towards those 10 days. So it's not counted as a removal. Now, if one of those things isn't in place, though, so say a student has access to their general education schoolwork, but they're not receiving their special education services, then it does count towards a day of removal. Out of school suspension and expulsion both count towards the 10 days of removal. So I'm going to let Jason pick up right here and talk a little bit more about this whole idea of informal removals from school.
So informal removals are where things get kind of gray and fuzzy. And I think that sometimes administrators may want to, and I'm going to assume good faith, they may want to, oh, I'm not going to suspend a child. But geez, I don't know that they should be here right now. And so they might say something like, is the school, uh, okay, please come pick up your child. This isn't a disciplinary thing, but he can't be back today. Um, this is a red flag, and I'm going to give the audience a chance to put in the chat why that something like this might be a red flag. Sarah's saying that because it's not a parent choice. Um, right. I mean, here's the thing, guys. If a parent, if you're being told as a parent, okay, let's go come pick up your child. If you're not having the choice, then technically that is probably a suspension. And I think it's important to clarify with the school, are you requiring me to do this? If the answer is yes, then that's actually a suspension. If the answer is no, then, you know, do you want to come get your child? What are you removing them? That's when we get things really gray. So I think that a thing that a parent can do is to be really clear, uh, what is happening right now? You know, are you requiring this? Is this a suggestion? But if it's a suggestion from an administrator, it gets very gray. And my coaching would be try to make it less gray and clear it up. Okay, go ahead and advance to the next slide, please.
I'm going to pop in just for a second.
Yes.
Alicia, I see you asked a question in there, and we will, I think that one's answered in a future slide. If not, we'll come back to that question.
Oh, okay. Here, it did advance and I didn't even see. Thank you for being patient. Okay, so we're going to go through some scenarios. Timmy is having a rough day. Would you like to come get him before we have to send him home? Um, and whoa.
Sorry, I was making sure the link I put in a helpful resource from Ask. I wanted to make sure the link was correct and it messed up your slide. I apologize.
Um, so that might be a red flag. Timmy can't come back until he takes his medication. Um, why? I'm going to give you guys a chance to do in your chat. Be brave, put something down. Why is it that Timmy can't come back until he takes his medication? It should be a red flag. They won't receive special ed services. Okay, here we go. Thank you for putting them in. Medical decision, not an educational one. Um, and then this is similar, right, to the next one, which Timmy can't come back until he's evaluated for. Um, you know, if you think about this, it gets complicated. Schools, it's reasonable for a school to say, gosh, I'm worried about Timmy. Um, maybe, you know, Timmy needs to see a doctor. Okay. That really becomes a coaching and a suggestion. And if they don't feel that appropriate care is being given to a child, it's completely appropriate for a school to make a DHS referral. If they think a child is in danger because of their psychiatric condition, they can do that, and that's appropriate. But again, we need to be clear about what is going on here. Is this a recommendation? Is this an encouragement? Or is this a disciplinary action? And in the lack of clarity, you know, we can't just say a disciplinary action is open-ended. We wouldn't do that for a typical student, right? We wouldn't say, okay, you're going to have a disciplinary action until blank and it runs in perpetuity. Um, disciplinary actions are normally time limited and clear. Are there any questions about that so far? Okay. Please go to the next slide. More red flags. Timmy was having a rough day, so we had him sit in the counselor's office. I think it would be better for everyone if you'd come and get Timmy for the rest of the day. Could you keep Timmy home tomorrow? The school has a field day planned. Again, you might sense a theme here. Here's the thing that ties all these red flags together is it's not Timmy's choice. It's not parents' choice. This is something that's being dictated. And if it's something that's being dictated by the school, it's actually either a disciplinary action or it's a change of placement. And again, you as a parent probably want to clarify what is happening here. Um, all kids should be able to go on a school day trip. And to say keep them home, that's potentially, they're Timmy's done nothing wrong. That's really like a change of placement for the day. That would count toward the 10 days because every child should have access to the field trip. And if not, then what's going on here? Is the IEP being followed? Are they getting the appropriate supports to be in the field trip? Is this covered in the IEP? This stuff gets very complicated and it raises a lot of questions, but that's part of what makes it a red flag. And I think that as parents, again, clarify, clarify, clarify. Um, are there any other questions about these red flags? Okay,
Don't
so
seem
go
to
ahead
be
and go to
having
the
any
next
right now.
slide. So I've already jumped ahead because that's what I do. Um, Clarify what's being happened. These are strategies. Keep track of your students' absences or these removals and how they're being coded so that you and the school can be on the same page and you can make sure the school's meeting their responsibilities and that they're clear what's happening. Because, you can have well-intended administrators who are trying to, who feel like, oh, I don't want to punish this kid, but then they're doing this stuff that technically is a removal. And so it's good for everyone to be clear. I'm not trying to assume negative intent here. Also, consider calling an IEP team meeting. I think that one of the things that if your child is having to be kept out, if they're having removals, if there's a lot of discipline, that would suggest if they have an IEP for discipline or for behavior rather, that would suggest the IEP may not be doing what it needs to do. And so we should problem solve that. The school has an obligation to try to provide an IEP that's calibrated to keep a student in their current placement. And if those services are not robust enough, then maybe we need to look at that. Also, ensure that the team is proactive. Again, we don't have to wait until 10 days. After 10 days of removal, we're talking about a manifestation determination. We're talking about procedures designed to protect, but why wait that long? As a parent, it's completely appropriate for you to ask for a team meeting before it gets that far. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please.
Jason, I'm going to
Yeah.
pop in. There's a question you've mentioned a number of times. Make sure you clarify
Yes.
with someone what those are. And the question is, with whom? My answer would be, I would start with whoever's making the first phone call, right?
Yeah.
So if you're getting a call from an administrator with any of those red flag statements, that'd be the first person I'd start with by saying, okay, tell me more about whatever's occurring. And then
Right.
as a parent, I mean, if it's, he's having a rough day, do you want to come get him? Of course you have that option. But then that's who I would clarify with is this a requirement that I come pick him up? If it's a requirement, will you be counting this as a suspension day? And just making sure everybody's on the same page. But whoever makes the call is who I'd start with.
Right. I agree completely. And I think that that's an important clarification too. When you say if it's required, it's a suspension day. That doesn't mean that because you come and get them, it doesn't count as a day,
Right.
right? If it's required, you can still come and get them because you think it's a good idea. But if it's required, it's a day.
Right. Correct.
That was
Okay.
perfect. That was a question Susie and I had for this as well was, is it appropriate to ask how the school is coding this? And that's the coding might be the suspension, the sickness.
Right.
Thank you
And
for that.
yeah, and I think that if, based on the information we're sharing, if the way they're coding it doesn't make sense, then that's an opportunity for a conversation. Because again, I don't want to assume ill intent on the part of administrators, but it's appropriate for a parent to advocate and make sure that the school is doing things right, in a way that honors their child's disability and their rights. Okay, so free and appropriate public education. I'm going to zoom out for a second because a lot of what we're talking about, there's an underlying principle here, which is schools can do a lot of stuff in that first 10 days. After that, they still have to offer a free and appropriate public education. And so, We in another webinar talked about manifestation determinations. After 10 days, those should happen. But let's say that the school is saying, okay, we're going to, for the next 10 days, we're going to offer FAPE, but it's in this alternate setting. The important thing is it needs to actually meet the standards of a free and appropriate public education. And it still should be time limited. It still should count as one of those three types of discipline. So a scenario that was presented to us before we came on is the school says, okay, for the rest of the semester, your child is going to be doing school online. Okay, that raises a lot of interesting questions. Is that a suspension? Is this an out-of-school suspension? It can't be an in-school suspension because an in-school suspension means it's on site. Is it an expulsion? An expulsion has to happen with board action, right? So again, clarifying with the administrator what is happening right now. Is it an IEP change? An IEP change requires a meeting with participants, and you have all of the due process actions that come with an IEP meeting. So if the district is proposing a change in the IEP, which might be appropriate, but that IEP meeting actually has to occur and you have to have all of your due process actions. Typically when I see a student's placement changed to be something like the rest of a semester for an extended period of time, it's going to be online, that typically occurs within the context of an IEP. And that may be completely appropriate, but you should have all of your rights in the course of doing that. Any questions about that? Because I think this is a really important concept to understand. A free and appropriate public education means they have access to general education. It also means they have access to their specially designed instruction. I'm trying to look at questions. Okay, Sarah, you added more
Good. Yep, I'm
specific.
just answering a couple as we go.
Okay, perfect. And feel free to ask questions here. I see a lot of stuff popping through here. If parents don't agree with a placement change, even with an IEP meeting, okay, so that's when you have your due process rights. And when they'll offer you that thick book, that's what that's about. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to understand, but you can ask for clarification. And you can also, this is where your Department of Education, Ask Resources are perfect supports for you to exercise your due process rights, which are considerable. Any other questions before we go to the next slide? Okay, let's go ahead and move forward. So short-term and long-term removals. This language is in the code, and so we just wanted to clarify. We've been actually talking about short-term and long-term removals without being clear about what it was. That short-term removal is 10 days or less. If we're talking about 10 days or more, and that could be cumulative, with several actions, now we're talking a long-term removal by definition. Now remember, in-school suspension might not count as one of those days. If it's on site, if it meets the requirements by code of what is a in-school suspension, where they have access to the general education, they have access to reasonable services to move their goals forward, that SDI, then it might not count. But if something counts and it's after 10 days, now we're talking long term. And then again, then you have FAPE kick in, which is access to general education and opportunity to progress toward meeting a student's goals. And a manifestation meeting has to occur if we're talking about a long-term removal. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Now, this is a reminder about special circumstances. There are exceptions to the rules regarding what I just discussed. For example, a school can change placement. That placement should still meet FAPE, but the school can change placement unilaterally if it's either a drug offense, which means the student possesses, uses, sells, or solicits the sale of drugs, or if it's a weapon offense where they're carrying or possessing a weapon, or if serious bodily injury is involved in the infraction. And serious bodily injury, the standard for that is quite high. When we say serious, we mean we're not talking bloody nose. We're talking life-threatening, life and limb serious. Any of those three things, the school can assert their right to change a placement for up to 45 days. Change of placement doesn't mean they don't receive anything. It doesn't mean that they're expelled, doesn't mean that they're suspended for 45 days. It means they're removing to a context and a setting that offers FAPE for 45 days, but they're doing that unilaterally. They don't need permission from parents and they don't need an IEP to do that. Sarah, did I say that correctly? Is there anything I just said that was wrong?
No, that sounded good.
Okay, perfect. Next slide, please.
Jason, there is a question about, can you clarify even further on the definition of serious bodily injury?
Okay, I'm going to try to do this from memory and you guys help me out. Serious bodily injury, I feel like, it's been a long time since I've looked in this, that it literally talks about life-threatening injuries.
Or disfigurement. I think the word
Or
disfigurement
disfigurement.
also
There, I
is
knew it was something. I have this in this my mind like a limb falling off or something. That probably is the disfigurement. But think life-altering injury, disfigurement or death being a possibility because of the nature of the injury.
There's another question.
Yes.
Oh, and the follow-up. Sorry, before I go to the next question, the follow-up was, so a person who has a laceration would not fall under this.
No.
In my interpretation, no. I will tell you, if a school ever reaches out to me and says, does this fall in the category of serious bodily injury? I tell them to seek the advice of their legal counsel. So I don't like to make the call for districts on what that looks like. But knowing the definition of serious bodily injury and knowing some of the court cases that have been around that, I would be surprised if anybody would say a laceration would fall.
Now, I suppose it depends on where the laceration is and how
True,
deep it is. Now
true.
if we're talking about a laceration of the neck that's going deep,
Yep,
or a laceration of the face, that might be different than a laceration on the arm that,
true.
Or
draws
a
into the blood.
laceration of an organ, right? Like let's say
Right, right, right.
punching in the abdomen and now we have a lacerated liver, right? Like
That's a
in
different,
the weeds, but that's a way different type of laceration.
I was
right.
actually involved in a situation where a student was pushed off of it was sort of a stage, and the student fell. They didn't receive any outward injuries, but it stopped their pacemaker.
Ooh.
Right? So the young student had a pacemaker. So that I think was considered serious bodily injury, right? So even like some of our small incidents that wouldn't normally result in significant damage, for this student, it was. So they're very, it's a unique situation and it depends on the student. And like Jean said, what exactly occurred.
I'm impressed that you even had an incidence of this. In all of my years doing this, I have not actually encountered a single incident of serious bodily injury being met or asserted. So it's quite rare. Um, any
And then
other
I'm gonna hold
questions?
the other question until
Yeah.
the end of our presentation. I'll let you finish.
Okay. Go ahead and advance. So next steps and effective solutions. It should be the goal of all parties to prevent removals. Okay. So again, I talked about this before. The IEP team is your friend, and calling an IEP team meeting before things get this bad will hopefully prevent it. If the IEP team is working to calibrate their services to prevent issues, which they should be. I mean, if they aren't, that's another cause for concern and another place where parents may want to utilize their rights, ask for evaluations. People should be working toward resolving issues. Um, Anticipated behaviors should be addressed by the IEP team, and removals should not reinforce problematic behaviors. These are really big deals. When I was a special ed director, I used to tell my IEP team that we needed to have in the behavior plan, you probably remember this, Gene, something that addressed any behavior that we could anticipate the student doing? Not that they had done, but that we would anticipate, because sometimes, students will do something one step more than what we expected. There's always that first time, right? So think about the types of behavior that this student does. What would be the next step more intense that we might anticipate would happen if something more intense happened? That was my advice to IEP teams. Because once we get past what we anticipate, that's when we're going to get in situations where we want removal so that we can, because it becomes disciplinary, or really just so that people can regroup and understand how to support a student. Also, removals should not reinforce problematic behavior. A lot of times, the common intervention of out of school suspension, which is very routine, reinforces problem behaviors. A lot of students don't want to be in school, and that can actually be an unintentional reward for students. What is punishing in a behavioral sense is not defined by what we code it. From a behavioral perspective, punishment means the behavior is less likely to occur. And if the disciplinary response reinforces behavior and makes it more likely to occur, then that's a problem. And you were going to quickly run through those 10 days, and we probably need to have a plan that's not going to do that. Um, Parents and schools always have the right to call an IEP team meeting to address concerns when they arise. That comes back to what I said earlier. Any questions about this? Okay, go ahead into the next slide. Ah, any questions, period? Oh, I see a question here. Second grade child kicked an adult with in the head, who was physically intervening, caused concussion. The staff missed school for 4 days. Uh, the school asserted was serious bodily injury. Is there a list? I do not know of a list. I'm going to refer back to Sarah and the idea that this is probably something where you consult, phone a friend if you're a district, and if you're a parent, you might want to phone a friend also. This would be where you could reach out to ask resources, because this stuff gets very complicated.
Yeah, no, there isn't a list. There's just the definition. Um, Again, like I can insert my opinion. I would say if the adult received a concussion from that, that likely could fall into that. I mean, you could be talking brain injury potentially. Um, but again, that's school districts gonna have to make that call, and if parents disagree, they can implement their due process or state complaint rights, is what I would
Yeah,
say.
I mean, it's an interesting example because I just
Yep.
said that I've never seen an incidence of it, but actually, in my practice, I've had multiple adults receive concussions, but serious bodily injury has never been asserted. Doesn't mean it couldn't be.
Right.
Um, so that's just an interesting example. What do the parents do if they disagree with the district's position that a child caused serious bodily injury? Again, that's those due process rights. Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
how do threats of damage and physical assault fit in here? Well, um, a threat is a threat. It's not an action. What I would say is, and you guys chime in this age where we have things like mass school shootings, threats are taken seriously and should be taken seriously, but they do not waive a student's uh, IDEA protections. I know as a practical matter, um, I have seen situations where services are put in place that are calibrated to ensure safety and still meet FAPE. Um, and so I think, again, this is a phone a friend, the details matter situation, but threats don't waive IDEA protections. They do not count as a serious bodily injury. But that said, I never want to be dismissive of a student's obligation to keep people safe, but there are ways to do that.
There was a question earlier from Lynn that said, can an IEP be written for for the change in placement, even if the parents are not in agreement, therefore limiting the application of the 45 days.
So I'm going to address the first part of this because the last part gets kind of confusing and I'm not sure I understand. But in general, um, the school, let's say that you have parties that disagree. The school then writes the IEP as they want it done. If it's an AEA service, the AEA writes that part of the IEP. But typically, we're talking about school services here. Um, so they're going to write it, and the parent has the right to due process. They can appeal, and those options are spelled out. They're about mediation. They're about going to an ALJ. Um, and so, typically what happens is we try to reach some kind of agreement, but parents do have a right if the school kind of digs in. The same would be true if the school asserted that something was not a manifestation of a student's disability and you disagreed. Scenario, a young child with a BIP in a moment of escalation states, I'm going to kill you. Thoughts on next steps to be considered by the district and or the IEP team. Um, what I said earlier about the school's obligation to keep people safe is true. That said, I see a lot of this type of behavior. Students who are escalated say things. The way in which the school and parents or anyone would interpret it might depend on things like, does the student have the ability to do that? Do they have access to weapons? Do they have um, the capacity to do harm? Have they actually ever hurt anyone? Those types of considerations matter um, in figuring out an appropriate response. Um, Schools do have disciplinary procedures for threats that they use for all students. One of the things I will say that we haven't mentioned much yet is the way we handle a student with a disability should not exceed um, what we would do for a student without a disability. So any student who makes a threat to kill someone, there is a typical kind of standard district response for that, and that's appropriate that there is. One would anticipate that response would be the same for a student with a disability, unless it's addressed by the IEP.
There was a question a little bit further up, and we've gotten asked this a few times at Ask. Can a school require a psychological evaluation to be completed before a student returns to school? Is the school then responsible for paying for that eval?
What I would say, and Sarah and Jean, feel free to jump in. First of all, I would want an agreement, things like who's going to pay and how this is going to happen before it actually happens. As I mentioned earlier, requiring that something be done before a student returns is inherently problematic. And I would think at a minimum, it would count toward the 10 days. Because if a student is being held out of school, then that would be an out of school suspension and it would count. Um, and then I would be concerned about whether the school is doing that for any student who displayed that behavior.
And then there's always that exception, right? So
Right.
if the team has met and said, this is how we're going to serve the student FAPE, alternatively, during this period of time to assess for safety, then that might not count towards, right, the
Agreed.
suspension days. So it's really tricky. This to me is one of those, it's never a yes, no.
Mhm.
It's a very great answer. It depends on, what is needed. What is the team agreed to? What threats have occurred? It's not only threats to school, but threats to self, right? We see a lot of students engaging in self-harm, and we're concerned about that. So this is one of those, it really depends on the context and the situation. But in general, I agree, Jason. We don't typically require something occurs before a student receives FAPE.
Well, and in the example you just gave, Sarah, about the team agreeing, that is an IEP change at that point. And so that is anytime the IEP team can always agree to do something in the best interest of the student. And I think that that's a really important distinction because if I'm a school or a parent, that's what I'm going to want is a team agreement and discussion about what is best for the student. Presumably if the school is wanting an evaluation, they have a reason for wanting an evaluation.
And I'm going back to something else that you said, Jason, and that was if as a parent or an IEP team member, if you are unsure about what that means, if that's being counted towards removal days, if this is a change in placement, if you don't have a clear answer to those questions, as a parent, you have that right to make sure that you ask those questions and get a clear answer from the administrators.
Yes. And that, I think, Tom said, would you clarify the 45-day limit for other placements? So this is that rare and unusual circumstances is the context in which I applied 45 days. And it only would apply if it met one of those conditions. It would be about drugs, it would be about weapons, it would be about serious bodily injury. In that circumstance, the way I imagine this, if you kind of think of it from why might have legislators put this in the law, um, they're buying time for things to get sorted out. So during that 45 days, the district has some unilateral authority to change placement. They still have to offer a free and appropriate public education, but they can make that placement change. An example in this day and age might be, okay, we're going to do services from online and offer FAPE that way. We're going to do something homebound or online or combination with homebound and do services that way. But it could also be a physical change in placement, but that can only last for 45 days unilaterally. The team might choose to change placements for a longer period of time, but then that would need to be an IEP team change. Does that answer your question?
And I will like to add, at Ask, we understand, we like to say, special education always starts with it depends, because it
Yes.
really depends on what a child needs and what is happening in that individual case. So we understand there's a lot of families, you might have a lot more personal questions on how this applies to you. Feel free to please use our contact us request form and select option 1 for a family support specialist, and we can work with you personally to help you kind of tease out how this information applies to your case. So if you need that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Do we have any other questions while we are here? All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for attending with us. And thank you so much to Jason, Jean, and Sarah for taking these last 2 weeks to be with us and teaching us about manifestation determination meeting and school removal. As Alicia just dropped in, here is the link to our manifestation determination recording from 2 weeks ago. Very helpful information from these three. So thank you all again for attending. We hope you found this helpful. And if you need more support in navigating your case or what is going on personally, don't hesitate to reach out to Ask. Again, thank you to Jason, Jean, and Sarah for joining us today.
Thank you for
Everyone,
the opportunity.
Pleasure.
yes, enjoy this nice weather we all having right now. Thank you all. Bye.